Hey everyone, Brendan Snyder here. How are you? Thank you so much for joining me and welcome to the biggest album fails from the past 40 years. Part 2. There was a part 1 on this. It posted yesterday. You can check that out and I will leave a link in the description below if you're interested. So it's nothing new that bands like to try new things, keep themselves interested, that sort of stuff. And of course, sometimes it works. U2, trying Achtung Baby, they changed just about everything about themselves and they had pay dirt. But that's kind of a rarity. Not a lot of times does that happen for bands. And usually it ends up being off-putting and considered a misstep by the media, by the fans, etc. And sometimes it's almost unrecoverable for those bands. And so it creates a lot of album fails. And we're going to cover 10 more of the biggest album fails as part of this, part 2. And as I mentioned, you can catch part 1 that filmed and posted yesterday. But before we get started, if you're new to my channel and you haven't already hit the subscribe button, please do. Also leave a comment, hit like, all those things help support my channel. I would greatly appreciate it. And of course, as an added bonus, by subscribing, you'll be able to stay up to date on all that's going on in the world of music, just like this with a very cool video called The Biggest Album Fails from the Past 40 Years. Part 2. All right, so we're picking up, we covered A through M in part 1. We're going to actually pick up with M because that's just a letter that a lot of great bands are a part of and we want to hit on. So we got a couple more M's to do and we will run through the rest of the alphabet. First one up, Midnight Oil, Redneck Wonderland from 1998, 10th studio album. And, throughout their career, the band had sort of mixed a post-punk sound with heartland rock style. But this here was really anything but that. And they went in an entirely new direction here, which just, I don't know, it baffled me at the time, at least when I got this here, adding drum loops and samples. And it was a real sort of cacophony of sound. And I found it very distracting and off-putting. And it's not one that I want to go back to very often. There's a lot of albums like this from the 90s era that bands attempted to do these things. And I really don't know what they were thinking. But it's hard on my ears, and so I don't go back to this sort of a thing. Next one, Motley Crue, Generation Swine, 1997. Seventh studio album. It was a reunion album. It was the follow-up to their self-titled 1994 album. But since it was a reunion album, we got Vince Neil coming back. You could kind of say it was a follow-up to Dr. Feelgood. And that one had sold 6 million copies. So a lot of people thought that, okay, the band is back together. They're going to have huge success again. And unfortunately, that was not the case with this. But it's because the album, again, band changes its sound, changes its direction, tries to modernize itself. And in that regard, when a lot of bands do that, it excludes their fan base. Maybe it brought in some new fans at the time, but for the big part, those fans that grew up with them and everything of that nature, looking for that return to form because they reunited, didn't happen here. And it was a big mess, in my opinion. Sometimes, again, bands can make albums that have different sounds that are still great. This one, in my opinion, not so much. My biggest complaint about this is you bring Vince back in to sing, and then what do? You let Tommy sing a song, you let Nicky sing a song, you add samples, drum loops, backbeats, things of that nature to it. All in all, just a huge misstep. This next one here is one of those ones where the band changes its sound, and I actually think it works, but unfortunately it didn't work as a whole for their fan base. Poison Native Tongue from 1993, their 4th studio album, follow-up to the multi-platinum Flesh and Blood. First to feature new guitarist Richie Kotzen taken over for guitarist CeCe DeVille. And while Richie Kotzen could actually shred with the best of them and could play in the style of CeCe DeVille, the band changes its sound. Now, so they go from a party rock sound into something that was focusing more on their soulful blues rock roots and things of that nature, which had always been part of their other sound, but they just really beefed that up here and doing a lot more acoustic guitar type stuff on here. And that's where I'm saying this was a good album, but did it sound like Poison? No, it didn't. And so if you were looking for that party rock sound, this was not it. And again, they managed to still have some success with it. They had a hit with the song Stand, but it didn't really translate into album sales. And unfortunately, I think all in all, it just alienated longtime fans, even though I know there's a few of you out there like me that actually still love this album amongst all the other great stuff that Poison did. Next one up, Queen, The Cosmos Rocks from 2008, 16th studio album. Follow-up to the 1995 posthumous release featuring Freddie Mercury on vocals after he had passed away. They completed that album. But now, in his place, we've got Paul Rodgers of Bad Company. And gone is the pomp and the bombast that is the key thing that I think that sets Queen apart. And instead, it's pretty much all blues rock. But that's because most of this stuff is written by Paul Rodgers, and as opposed to, I think, that it being a truly collaborative effort and trying to make a Queen sounding album, they just made an album, and maybe it really shouldn't have been called Queen plus Paul Rodgers. Maybe it should have been under a different name. It should have been a supergroup. Who knows? But for me, at least, it's just a huge misstep of an album that doesn't sound like Queen, that really just hurts the name in the end of the day. I like it okay, but I like it as a Paul Rodgers album, not as a Queen album. Next one, Scorpions' Humanity, Hour 1, 2007, 16th studio album, produced by James Michael and the other person, Desmond Child. That in and of itself, you would think would make this album really great. Desmond Child is one of those guys back from the 80s that co-writing the songs, production stuff of that level, guarantee these albums to be successful, have hits off of them, all that sort of stuff. You take the Scorpions, you take Desmond Child, you put them together, and it should have been perfect. So on paper, sounded great, but what did they do? They went on to make a more modern rock style album, and it just, I don't know, it had down-tuned guitars, it was darker style, little of the characteristic that I knew and loved from the Scorpions sound, and just barely being memorable in the end of the day. Again, this is just my take on it here. This is not an album that I was anticipating with all the hype and lead up of the pairing of two of the biggest people out of the 80s. And yeah, who knows? Next one up, Skid Row, Subhuman Race from 1995, third studio album, follow-up to the multi-platinum Slave to the Grind. And again, you have the self-titled album, which did $5 million. You have Slave to the Grind, which did $2 million in sales and was the first metal album to enter the charts at #1. This one here, last album featuring Sebastian Bach, so we still have him in tow. It is 1995, but I mean, come on, it was Skid Row. The album was produced by Bob Rock, who'd worked with Motley Crue, Metallica, two of the biggest albums from the past, decade. And again, the pairing of Skid Row with Bob Rock, you would think this thing here would have been huge, would be a good thing. But what did they do? They changed the sound again. Now, Skid Row had done that. First album changed to Slave to the Grind. They got heavier. And what did they do? They got heavier again on this here. But they down-tuned the guitars. The sound is very muddied on here. I find it to be very uninspired. There's less energy on this than their previous albums. And it was just a real shock at the time. I remember hearing some of this stuff and couldn't believe that it was Skid Row. In fact, it didn't even sound like it. There's less of Sebastian Bach's trademark style vocals on this, which is the thing that really made Skid Row. And I think that in and of itself was just a huge off-putting thing. I think Skid Row, had they made another Slave to the Grind album, I think they could have just carried right on through the 90s. And even with this here, if they had done this and then gone a little back to their style after this, they could have maintained their popularity. But unfortunately, not to be the case. Okay, next one up. Slaughter Revolution from 1997, fourth studio album. Instead of staying with their trademark glam metal sound that had served them really well off their first two albums, they decided to try something new. Now, what was interesting is they didn't try grunge, which was the popular thing up until about 1996. Granted, this is coming out in 97 here, but they end up going back to a sort of 60s hippie style mixed with an early 70s classic rock vibe. And, again, in theory, thinking Slaughter making a, 1970s style album should be good, but the acoustic flavor of the tracks, the songs were slowed down considerably on here, and in my opinion, just coming across as very watered down versions of some of their better sounding songs from back in the day. Didn't sit well with me, and I think it made it very hard to come back with. Unfortunately, their lead guitar player, Tim, would be killed in a car accident, and I think with this album here sounding the way that it was, not being the classic sound, losing a key member, that by the time they made their next album, which was more of a return to form style, nobody cared at that point, which is very unfortunate. Next one, Tesla, Shock. And boy, was this album a shock in 2019. 10th studio album. So for this one here, the band decided to collaborate with Phil Collen of Def Leppard. Def Leppard, Tesla sounds great to me, right? He would co-write on this. He played guitar on it. He produces the album. I'm expecting this thing here to be an amazing return to form Tesla style album from the 80s. But instead, the thing here really sounds like a Def Leppard album, and I don't know who was thinking this would be a good idea. Let's bring in somebody from Def Leppard and let's sound like Def Leppard, when instead Tesla was really a classic rock sounding band. They got lumped in with the glam metal sound, and I would still call them a glam metal band, but they were really a classic rock style band, jeans and t-shirts and things of that nature. They were not glam metal. And case in point, they've got a song on here called Taste Like, but really sounds like a watered down Pour Some Sugar on Me Part 2, as opposed to anything that Tesla ever did. And I, for one, I don't need it. I want to hear Tesla. If I want Def Leppard, I will listen to Def Leppard. I don't need another band out of the 80s like Tesla to do it for me. There's far better Def Leppard stuff out there. So, yeah, like I said, Shock, that was a perfect title for it because it really did shock a lot of people. And this one here being their last album to date, still haven't done anything since 2019. They've released a few singles, but looks like they're having a hard time pulling back from this at this point. Next one up, Van Halen 3 from 1998, 11th studio album. Follow-up from the multi-platinum Balance in 1995. This one here featuring new vocalist Gary Sharon from Extreme. But while I do like the album, and don't get me wrong as far as that's concerned, all of the songs on here sound like they're trying too hard to be like past hits from Van Halen. And so for me, at least, that comes across as being contrived, that they were trying to write hits instead of just writing what they wanted to write for a Van Halen album. And so in that regard, they're almost not trying something new on here because they're trying too hard to be like their old selves. And it really sounded like second-rate stuff. But where they do try to do something new on here, like have Eddie sing lead vocals on the song How Many Say I think was a huge miscalculation. And even though it's the last track on the album, again, it just throws me off. It's like Motley Crue having other members of the band sing. It is not what you want, and it was not good, and I don't think they should have done it. And it just leaves a bad taste in my mouth. When the last song on the album is so bad, I don't want to restart it over. And unfortunately, I think that's what a lot of people felt about this. And it just was a miscalculated step. All right, and the last one we're going to talk about here, yes, Magnification from 2001, 19th studio album. Yes, is one of my favorite bands, but even they have made a big miscalculation here with this. First album without a keyboardist on it, so what do they decide to do? Make an album with an orchestra. And in theory, again, that sounds great. Yes, prog rock group that is very skilled, musically. It's going to record with an orchestra. But for whatever reason, it just didn't work here. And you got to remember too, this was also the era of bands recording with orchestras. Metallica had released S&M. It sells 4 million copies, so every band wants to record with an orchestra, and there was a little bit of that. And so I do think there was a little bit too much of bands recording with orchestras, which probably also helped in being a bit off-putting when Yes decided to do it here. But I just found this to be very uninspiring. The songs are not memorable. I have tried again and again and again to get into this album, and I found a couple tracks on here that I do like, but as a whole, this is just not one that I go back to, and I can't really say what is lacking other than perhaps it is missing that keyboard sound. You need the keyboardist still in there, then doing the orchestra thing, which is what they're doing today. Their last 2 albums today have also incorporated an orchestra, but they still have a keyboardist in there. And so there you go. That is 10 more of the biggest album fails from the last 40 years. This was part 2. Don't forget to check out part 1. I will leave a link in the description below to that. Hopefully you will have enjoyed all 20 of these albums. Certainly there are ones I'm sure that you guys want to throw out and think are also big album fails. Let me know what those are. Let me know your thoughts on these. But otherwise, hope you enjoyed it. Take care. Have a good one, and I'll talk to you real soon. Bye-bye, everyone.